My daughter gave me a cruel ultimatum: sell the house I'd lived in for 50 years, or I would never see my grandchildren again. She called me selfish and started spreading vicious lies, trying to turn the entire town against me, convinced she could break me by making me all alone. But she made one fatal miscalculation. She had no idea that my quiet little phone call to a friend had just set in motion a perfect public reckoning, and her own party was about to become the main stage for her downfall. My daughter gave me a cruel ultimatum: sell the house I'd lived in for 50 years, or I would never see my grandchildren again. She called me selfish and started spreading vicious lies, trying to turn the entire town against me, convinced she could break me by making me all alone. But she made one fatal miscalculation. She had no idea that my quiet little phone call to a friend had just set in motion a perfect public reckoning, and her own party was about to become the main stage for her downfall. There's a special kind of quiet that fills a house after the grandkids leave. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's a hollow one, full of echoes of laughter that were there just moments before. That Sunday, the silence felt heavier than usual, pressing in on me from the corners of the dining room where the scent of my pot roast still lingered in the air. Just an hour earlier, this room had been alive. My 10-year-old grandson Sam was telling me all about a video game, with his mouth half full of mashed potatoes, his eyes wide with excitement. And little Lily, my 8-year-old ray of sunshine, was showing me the gap where her front tooth used to be giggling every time her tongue poked through it. That sound, her sweet, innocent giggle, was the music my old heart beat to. For those few hours every Sunday, my world felt whole. This big old house, the one I'd lived in for 50 years, felt like a home again. My daughter Jessica sat at the head of the table, a place my husband Robert had occupied until he passed. She watched her children with a tight smile. It was a smile I knew well. It didn't quite reach her eyes. She kept glancing around the room at the high ceilings and the mahogany buffet Robert and I bought on our 10th anniversary. She told me how wonderful the new Science Museum was in Charlotte, how many more opportunities the kids would have if they just lived a little closer to the city. She said it was amazing what kinds of programs were available for gifted children these days. She said it while looking straight at Sam as if to remind him of what he was missing. Later, while I was cutting the apple pie, she sighed dramatically and talked about how cramped their 2-bedroom apartment felt. It was a constant drumbeat, this talk of the city and its endless promise. I just smiled and cut another slice of pie for Lily. I knew what she was really saying. Her words were little stones she kept tossing at the windows of my piece, testing for a crack. For months it had been the same conversation circling the same topic. This house. My house. She saw it not as a home filled with memories, but as a pile of money we were all sitting on. Money that could fund her bigger, better life in the city. Just as we were finishing dessert, our neighbor, Carol Gable, tapped on the screen door. She's a sweet woman, head of the church hospitality committee. She held up a brightly colored flyer. She wouldn't come in, just wanted to make sure I got one. It was for the annual Founders Day picnic. She told me the whole town was counting on my pecan pie and that no one could organize the bake sale table quite like I could. I promised her I'd be there, that I'd already bought the pecans. Her words were a balm on the little stings from Jessica's comments. Out here in my town, I wasn't just an old woman in a big house. I was Martha. I was needed. After Jessica had wrangled the kids into her car with promises of ice cream and threats of taking away their tablets, I stood at the door, waving until their tail lights disappeared down the street. The quiet descended instantly. I started clearing the table, scraping plates and rinsing dishes. My movements slow and automatic. I carried the old photo album we'd been looking at back to the bookshelf in the living room. It was open to a picture of me and Robert Young, and smiling on the day we bought this house, a tiny Jessica in my arms. My hand was still on the cover when I heard Jessica's voice from the driveway. I figured she'd forgotten something, but the voice was sharp angry. It wasn't the voice she used with me. It was hard like flint. I froze, standing in the shadows of the living room, the window slightly ajar. She must have been on her phone, pacing by her car. The words she spoke traveled through the humid evening air and hit me with the force of a physical blow. I heard her say it, her voice dripping with a cold fury I'd never known she possessed. She was talking to her husband, I supposed, finishing the conversation they'd started before they even arrived. I heard her tell him that I'd said no again, that I was being stubborn. And then the final devastating words that would echo in my mind for days to come. She said she gave me one last chance. She said if I wouldn't sell, then he knew the deal. No more kids. And she'd make sure this whole town knew she had a selfish mother who'd rather have a dusty old house than her own family. The car door slammed. The engine roared to life, and she was gone, leaving those words hanging in the silence. And in that moment, the hollow quiet of my empty house was filled with a terrifying, absolute clarity. For the next 3 days, my house was a tomb. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a hammer blow counting down the seconds of my isolation. The phone, usually my lifeline to the outside world, sat silent on its cradle, a black plastic monument to my daughter's cruelty. I'd pick it up sometimes just to make sure there was still a dial tone, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But the steady hum was always there, a reminder that the line was open, but no one was calling. Especially not the 2 little voices I longed to hear. Sleep offered no escape. I'd close my eyes and hear her words on a loop. No more kids. I'll make sure this whole town knows. The threat was two-pronged, a poisoned dart aimed at my heart and my reputation. The first part, losing my grandchildren, was a clean, sharp wound that left me breathless. The second part was a slower, creeping poison. In a town like ours, a person's good name is the most valuable thing they own. It's a currency built over a lifetime of small kindnesses, bake sale fundraisers, and sitting with neighbors on their porches in times of grief. I had spent 50 years building my accounts, and Jessica was threatening to bankrupt me with a few well-placed lies. I didn't go to church that next Sunday. I couldn't. The thought of facing everyone, of seeing the whispers and the pitying looks that Jessica's stories would surely create, was more than I could bear. I imagined her there, dressed in somber colors, playing the part of the long-suffering daughter, collecting sympathy like she was collecting for a charity drive. I spent the morning sitting in Robert's old armchair, a photo album on my lap, feeling the walls of my own home close in on me. It was late that afternoon when a car pulled into my driveway. My heart leaped, a foolish, reflexive hope that it was her that she'd had a change of heart. But it was Eleanor, Pastor John's wife. She walked up the steps, carrying a small basket covered with a tea towel. She had a gentle smile on her face, but her eyes were full of a knowing concern that went right to my core. She said she'd made too much cornbread and thought of me. We both knew it was a lie, a kind one, but a lie nonetheless. It was the Southern way of saying, I know something is wrong, and I am here. I invited her in for tea, my voice rusty from disuse. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence thick between us for a few moments, before she reached across and patted my hand. She told me she'd missed me at the service. Then she took a slow sip of her tea and looked at me directly. She said there was something I ought to know. After the sermon, she told me Jessica had cornered Pastor John near the vestry. Eleanor had been close by arranging flowers and couldn't help but overhear. She described how Jessica had tears in her eyes, how she spoke in a hushed, trembling voice about how worried she was for me, how I was all alone in this big house, confused and stubborn, refusing to accept the help my loving family was offering. Jessica had painted a masterpiece of filial concern, a portrait of a daughter at her wits' end. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine as Eleanor spoke. It was happening. The smear campaign had begun, and she'd started at the very top, with the most respected man in our community. I closed my eyes, bracing for the rest of the story, for the part where Eleanor would tell me the pastor had offered prayers for my confused state of mind. But that's not what happened. Eleanor leaned in closer, her voice dropping to an conspiratorial whisper. She said, Pastor John listened to Jessica's entire performance without interruption, his face impassive. When she finally finished sniffling into a tissue for dramatic effect, he didn't pat her arm or offer words of comfort. He just stood there for a moment looking at my daughter, the full weight of his 30 years of ministry behind his gaze. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't angry, Eleanor said, but it was firm like the solid oak of the church doors. He told Jessica that he appreciated her concern. And then he said the words that felt like the first ray of sunshine after a week of rain. He told her that he had known her mother for 30 years. He said he clearly remembered how when the town couldn't get the funding, it was Martha who organized the drive, who went door to door for 6 months to raise the money that built the youth center where Jessica herself had learned to play basketball. He told her that because of that, selfish was the last word in the entire English language he would ever use to describe me. And with that, he simply said he had to prepare for the evening service, turned around and walked away, leaving Jessica standing there alone in the hall. Eleanor said my daughter's face was a sight to behold. The tears vanished instantly. Her mouth hung open slightly, her mask of sorrow and concern completely gone, replaced by pure, slack-jawed shock. The first seed of her poisonous narrative hadn't just failed to sprout. The ground itself had rejected it. When Eleanor left, I walked back into the living room and looked around. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a fortress. A quiet, unassuming fortress whose walls weren't made of brick and mortar, but of 40 years of kindness, of remembered favors, of pecan pies and casserole dishes, and the unshakable memory of a community. My daughter had fired her first shot, and it had bounced right off. I was still alone and my grandchildren were still gone, but for the first time in days, I didn't feel helpless. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since I'd heard her voice in the driveway. I felt the stirrings of a fight. That small victory with Pastor John was like a single candle lit in a vast dark room. It was a comfort, a tiny pinprick of light, but the darkness of my daughter's silence still stretched out in every direction. Another week crawled by. The phone calls I made to Jessica went straight to her voicemail, a cheerful recorded version of my daughter's voice that felt like a special kind of mockery. I never left a message. What was there to say? Are you really doing this? Are you really keeping my grandbabies from me? I knew the answer. The silence was her weapon, and she was wielding it with a brutal efficiency. I could almost picture her in her cramped city apartment looking at her phone when my name flashed across the screen. I could see the smug little smile, the satisfaction she'd feel as she pressed the button to decline the call. She was waiting for me to break. In her mind, I was just a lonely old woman, rattling around in a big house, my resolve weakening with every tick of the clock. She believed my love for Sam and Lily was her ace in the hole, and that eventually I'd fold my hand and give her everything she wanted just to hear their voices again. And the most painful part is she was almost right. My breaking point came on a Thursday. I was dusting the living room trying to impose some sense of order on my chaotic feelings when I reached under the sofa cushions to straighten them. My fingers brushed against something small and hard. It was one of Sam's little plastic army men, a green soldier frozen in a permanent charging position. I pulled it out and just stared at it, this tiny, forgotten piece of him. and suddenly the grief was a physical thing, a wave that rose up and crashed over me, leaving me gasping for air. I sank into the armchair, clutching that little toy soldier so tightly, its plastic edges dug into my palm, and I wept. I wept for my lost Sundays, for bedtime stories I wouldn't get to read, for the gap in Lily's smile that would be filled in by the time I saw her again. I cried until there were no tears left, only a hollow ache in my chest. I sat there in the quiet for a long time, watching the afternoon sun slant across the floorboards. Jessica thought this silence was her victory. She thought it was breaking me. But as I sat there, a different feeling began to take root in the barren ground of my sorrow. It was a slow, burning anger. She wasn't just taking my grandchildren, she was trying to erase my entire life, to paint me as some selfish dragon guarding a hoard of treasure. She was counting on my love for the kids to make me weak. But she'd forgotten that the same love that made me gentle could also make me fierce. I pushed myself out of the chair, my joints protesting, and walked with a new sense of purpose to the little writing desk in the kitchen. I pulled out my old address book. It's a worn, leather-bound thing, the pages soft and yellowed with age. The spine is cracked, and it's overflowing with scraps of paper and newspaper clippings. It's a testament to a life lived in community. Inside, in my own looping cursive, were the names and numbers of people I had known for 50 years. People I'd brought meals to when they were sick. People whose hands I'd held at funerals. People who I'd celebrated weddings and baptisms with. My finger traced down the page past names that were now just memories. Then it stopped. Eleanor Gable, Pastor John's wife, the mayor's wife. But more than that, she was a friend. Eleanor understood how our town worked. She knew the power of a quiet word, the weight of a shared prayer. She was not a gossip, but she was a conductor standing at the center of the town's intricate social orchestra. I picked up the phone, my hand surprisingly steady, and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice as warm and comforting as a summer afternoon. She asked how I was holding up. I took a deep breath. This was it. This was the move. I didn't cry. I didn't complain or list my grievances. I kept my voice even and calm, letting the weight of my words carry the true meaning. I just told her it was good to hear her voice. Then I said it, the simple phrase that was a flare sent up in the night. I told her, Eleanor, I'm in a bit of a trying situation right now, and I could surely use your prayers. There was a pause on the other end of the line, but it wasn't a pause of confusion. It was a pause of understanding. The message had been received. She didn't press for details. She didn't need to. She just said, of course, Martha, of course. She told me to take care of myself and to know that she was thinking of me. When I hung up the phone, the house was just as silent as it had been before. My grandchildren were still gone. My daughter still hated me. Nothing on the surface had changed, but everything had changed. The silence was no longer my enemy. It was now my shield. It was the quiet of a seed being planted in fertile ground. It was the silence of a chess player who has just made a critical move and now simply waits for her opponent to realize the game has shifted. Jessica thought she was in control. She thought her silence was her power. She had no idea that I had just activated a power of my own. After my phone call to Eleanor, a new kind of quiet settled over the house. It wasn't the hollow, grief-stricken silence of the week before, nor was it the tense, waiting silence of the day after. This was a quiet filled with a strange humming potential. It felt like the deep breath the world takes right before a thunderstorm. I had sent my signal flare into the night, and now all I could do was wait and see if anyone had seen it. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of my life, watering my plants, dusting furniture that was already clean, but my ears were always perked, listening for a sign. The sign came on Saturday afternoon in the form of a familiar blue sedan pulling into my driveway. It was Eleanor's car. My heart gave a little flutter, a mix of hope and anxiety. I smoothed my apron and went to the front door, opening it just as she was stepping onto the porch. She was carrying a large Pyrex dish covered in foil, the familiar scent of baked ziti wafting from it. She smiled at me, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She told me she was trying a new recipe and made far too much for just her and the mayor. I knew, of course, that this was just the first move in a game I didn't fully understand. I thanked her, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. As I took the warm, heavy dish from her, I glanced across the lawn to my daughter's house next door. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Jessica was home. Her car was in the driveway. I saw the curtain in her living room window twitch, just a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. She was watching. Before Eleanor had even stepped off the porch, a second car pulled up to the curb. It was Margaret, who ran the town's historical society, and whose family had lived here even longer than mine. She emerged holding a bouquet of hydrangeas from her own garden, their blue and purple heads bobbing in the breeze. She came up the steps and gave me a firm, one-armed hug. She told me she was just thinking of me and wanted to bring something to brighten up the house. As she said it, she glanced pointedly at Eleanor's casserole in my hands, and a silent, powerful understanding passed between the three of us. Then came the third car. This time it was Sarah, a retired school teacher, who had taught both my daughter and my grandchildren. She had a lemon meringue pie, its snowy peaks perfectly toasted. She set it down on the porch railing and took both of my hands in hers. She told me she'd heard I was going through a trying time, and that's when I finally understood. This wasn't a series of coincidences. This wasn't just a few friends dropping by. This was a coordinated, deliberate, and beautifully Southern declaration of war. It was a casserole offensive. The four of us stood on my porch for a good 10 minutes, making small talk about the weather and the upcoming Founders' Day picnic. But the conversation wasn't the point. The visibility was the point. We were a tableau of this town's matriarchy gathered on my front porch in the bright afternoon sun for anyone and everyone to see. I looked over at Jessica's house again. The curtain was no longer twitching. It was pulled back just enough for me to see her silhouette, a dark shape, standing motionless in the window. I could feel her shock radiating across the lawn. I could imagine the gears grinding in her head as her entire strategy crumbled to dust. She had built her plan on a single flawed premise that I was alone. She thought she could cut me off from my family and then methodically poison my friendships, leaving me isolated and desperate. She believed the town would see a lonely old woman and a concerned, loving daughter. But what she was seeing from her window was something else entirely. She was seeing a queen on her own porch, surrounded by her loyal court. She wasn't seeing a victim. She was seeing a woman so deeply woven into the fabric of her community that when one thread was pulled, the entire tapestry tightened to protect it. My phone call to Eleanor hadn't been a plea for help. It had been a summons. I hadn't aired my dirty laundry. I had simply alerted the network that one of its own was under attack. The women left one by one, their cars pulling away, leaving me with a porch laden with enough food to feed an army and a heart full of a strength that was not entirely my own. I carried the pie, the flowers, and the casserole inside, placing them on my kitchen counter. The house was filled with the scents of baked cheese, sweet lemons, and fresh-cut flowers. It was the scent of loyalty. Jessica's smear campaign hadn't just failed. It had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. In her attempt to define me to the town, she had inadvertently reminded the town what I meant to them. She hadn't started a wave of gossip against me. She had triggered a powerful protective response for me. The community wasn't just ignoring her, they were actively, publicly, and deliciously mobilizing on my behalf. I looked out my kitchen window across the lawn to her house. The curtain had been drawn shut. The show was over for the day. The first battle had been fought not with angry words or legal threats, but with kindness, loyalty, and a perfectly baked ziti. And I had won. The day of the Founders' Day picnic arrived on a wave of thick, humid air that promised a sweltering afternoon. It was also the day of Jessica's big backyard barbecue. From my vantage point on the front porch swing, a tall glass of iced tea sweating in my hand, I had a perfect view of both my own quiet, expectant lawn and the preparations happening on hers. Eleanor had called me the morning before. She didn't say much, just told me not to make any plans for the afternoon and to make sure I was home around 2 o'clock. She said it might be a good day for sitting on the porch, so that's what I did. I watched as Jessica and her husband scurried around their yard. They'd hung a string of festive store-bought lanterns that looked garish and out of place in the bright sunlight. They set up a small table with a plastic checkered cloth laden with bowls of chips and a vat of luridly red punch. The grill was smoking, sending up plumes of gray smoke that smelled of lighter fluid and desperation. A portable speaker started blaring some loud, thumping music that had no place on our quiet street on a Saturday afternoon. A few cars I didn't recognize began to arrive. City friends of hers, I presumed. They were younger, dressed in clothes that were too stylish for a simple barbecue, and they milled about awkwardly on the lawn, holding their red plastic cups and making stilted conversation. The scene was exactly what it was, a desperate attempt to purchase social standing, a party thrown not for celebration, but for impression, and the guests of honor, the influential town members she so desperately wanted to court, were nowhere to be seen. Then at 2 o'clock, exactly when the town picnic was scheduled to begin at the park, I saw it. A single car turned onto our street, moving slowly, deliberately. It was the mayor's familiar black sedan. For a breathless moment, my heart caught in my throat. I saw Jessica straighten up, a hopeful, triumphant smile beginning to form on her face as she watched it approach. The car slowed as it neared her driveway, and her smile widened. This was it, the validation she craved. But the car didn't turn. It glided right past her driveway, past the sad, hopeful little party, and pulled to a neat stop directly in front of my house. Before the dust had even settled, a second vehicle appeared. The sheriff's cruiser, its lights off, followed in the mayor's wake. Then came Pastor John's minivan. Then Margaret's station wagon. Then another car and another and another. It wasn't a trickle. It was a procession. A slow, stately, and undeniable parade of the heart and soul of our town. And every single one of them was bypassing my daughter's house to park in front of mine. The car doors opened. The mayor and Eleanor got out carrying a massive wicker picnic basket between them. The sheriff tipped his hat in my direction with a warm grin. Pastor John and his wife began unfolding lawn chairs on my grass as if it were the most natural thing in the world. People I'd known my whole life started emerging from their cars carrying coolers, blankets, and platters of food. Within minutes, my quiet front lawn was transformed. It was covered in checkered blankets and laughing people. The real Founders' Day picnic, it turned out, had simply been relocated. I looked across the lawn at Jessica. The thumping music from her speaker had sputtered out. Her few city friends were staring their mouths agape, looking from the vibrant, joyful gathering that had materialized on my lawn to the pathetic little party they were attending. They started to murmur to each other. I saw one of them check her phone, then whisper to her friend. A moment later, they were making their excuses to Jessica, waving a hasty, awkward goodbye as they scurried back to their car and fled. Then another couple left, and another. Soon there was no one left in her yard but her and her husband. She was standing frozen by the grill, a pair of long metal tongs hanging uselessly from her limp hand. Her face, which had been alight with hopeful triumph just minutes before, was a blank mask of disbelief and utter humiliation. The festive lanterns now seemed to mock her, their bright colors a stark contrast to the desolate silence of her empty yard. She was a ghost at her own feast. Someone, I think it was Sarah, the retired teacher, gently took the iced tea from my hand and replaced it with a paper plate piled high with potato salad, fried chicken, and a slice of watermelon. The mayor stood on my porch steps and cleared his throat. He said there had been some thought of moving the picnic this year, but they'd all decided there was no better place to celebrate the spirit of the town's founding than on the lawn of someone who so perfectly embodied that spirit. He raised his plastic cup of lemonade and said my name, and the whole lawn erupted in a cheer. I sat there in a lawn chair someone had set up for me, surrounded by the warmth and laughter of my true family. The air was filled with the familiar, comforting sounds of my community. And across the lawn, in the deafening silence of her own making, stood my daughter, a solitary, defeated figure. There was no anger in my heart, no feeling of vengeful glee. There was only a profound quiet and unshakable sense of justice. The reckoning on Elm Street hadn't come with a thunderclap or a storm. It had come with picnic baskets and friendly faces, a force of love so powerful and so public that it had simply erased her hatred, leaving nothing behind. The week that followed the picnic on my lawn was unlike any I had lived in years. The oppressive silence that had been my constant companion was gone, replaced by a gentle, steady hum of life. My front door, which had felt like a barricade against the world, was now a revolving door of friendly faces. Eleanor would stop by on her way back from the post office just to chat for a minute on the porch. Margaret called twice to ask for my secret to a flaky pie crust, a secret she'd known for 20 years. It was her way of checking in. The sheriff slowed his cruiser every time he passed, giving a little wave that felt like a protective salute. My house had become a hub. It was no longer just a place where I lived. It was a part of the town's living, breathing ecosystem. The kitchen counter was never without a plate of cookies someone had dropped off, and the phone rang with invitations for coffee for bridge, for a walk in the park. My community, my true family, had wrapped its arms around me, and their embrace was warm and strong. They had filled the hollow spaces in my home with their laughter and their kindness. I saw very little of the house next door. The curtains remained drawn most of the time. The silence from that yard was now the silence of shame, not of strategy. The power had shifted so completely that it felt like the landscape of our street had been permanently altered. Then on a quiet Tuesday evening, Jessica's car pulled into her driveway. She didn't get out right away. She just sat in the driver's seat for a long time, as if gathering the courage to face the 100 feet of lawn that separated our two homes. When she finally emerged, she looked smaller, somehow diminished. Her usual confident stride was gone, replaced by a hesitant, shuffling walk. She came to my door and knocked softly, a sound so tentative I almost didn't hear it. I opened the door and found my daughter standing on my porch, her face pale and stained with tears. The anger and entitlement were gone, replaced by a raw, ragged brokenness. It was the face of someone whose entire world had been turned upside down. I didn't say anything. I just held the door open, and she walked past me into the kitchen, slumping into a chair at the table where I had made the phone call that had changed everything. She wept for a while, a messy, shuddering kind of crying that was part grief and part self-pity. She asked me how I could have done it, how I could have turned the whole town against her, how I could have humiliated her in front of everyone. Her words were still looking for a place to lay blame, for a way to make this my fault. I listened patiently, letting her pour out all her bitterness and confusion. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. The time for that was long past. I simply let her exhaust her own narrative. When she finally fell silent, looking at me with swollen, questioning eyes, waiting for my reaction, I took a slow breath. I reached across the table, but I didn't touch her. I looked directly into her eyes, and the voice that came out of me was not one of anger or of triumph. It was just the voice of truth, calm and steady and unchangeable as the river that runs south of town. I told her that I hadn't turned anyone against her. I told her that she had spent months trying to convince the town that I was a selfish, unloving mother, and that all the town did was look at the evidence of their own eyes at 40 years of my life and decide for themselves what was true. Her face crumpled again, and she started to cry, that she had nothing, that she had lost everything. And that's when I knew I had to draw the final, permanent line. I told her, my voice never rising, that I loved her, that a part of my heart would always break for her, but that our relationship from this day forward would have to be built on a new foundation. And then I said the words that had been forming in my soul for weeks. I'm not done loving you, Jessica, but I am done funding the fantasy that love means servitude. The words hung in the air between us, clear and solid. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a declaration. I told her that my love was not a commodity to be traded for access to my bank account. And I told her that my heart ached for my grandchildren, and that the moment she was ready for them to have a grandmother, not a financial resource, my door would be open to them. The choice, I said, was now hers. She stared at me, the tears slowing as the finality of my words sank in. She was seeing me for the first time not as her mother, but as a person with a will of her own, with a line that had finally been crossed. There was nothing left for her to fight, nothing to manipulate. There was only the quiet, unshakable truth. She left without another word, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I watched her walk across the lawn back to her silent house. I felt no joy in her pain, only a deep, sorrowful peace in my own heart. The war was over, and in its place was a new reality, one built not on obligation or guilt, but on the simple, powerful fact that my life, my home, and my self-respect were my own, and they were no longer for sale. In the end, Martha understood the nature of her true wealth. Her daughter saw value only in a house, an asset to be sold, failing to see the far greater fortune her mother had built over 40 years, an unbreakable portfolio of goodwill. She learned that you cannot demand loyalty with threats or ultimatums. It is a dividend paid out from a lifetime of small kindnesses, shared sorrows, and unwavering support. When her own family tried to isolate her, her true family, the community she had nurtured, showed up on her lawn and proved that real partnership is about who stands with you in the storm.